Buongiorno a tutti e a tutte. È un piacere iniziare questa nuova fase degli eventi che terremo qui al Sondrio Check, eventi che hanno il segno dello studio biblico e lo faremo in collaborazione con altre sorelle e fratelli. In particolare siamo partiti con, così faccio anche questo gesto simbolico che era rimasto appeso, con il 15 marzo chiaramente siamo in differita rispetto a quell'evento perché per problemi tecnici non potemmo avviare l'evento, ma poco importa. La registrazione si tenne, fu un bellissimo studio biblico con la professoressa Kathy Ehrensperger, di cui ci dirà maggiori specifiche il fratello Benatti, che è il sovrintendente dell'8° circuito delle chiese metodiste e valdesi, e Jonathan ci appunto racconterà di lei e poi lascerà la parola a lei. Ci sarà diciamo, ecco, questo studio biblico è anche uno studio biblico che va nella direzione di essere riconosciuto con un credito dalla facoltà, è uno studio biblico in inglese, facoltà valdese di teologia che è a Roma, chiaramente parlo di essa, è uno studio biblico in inglese. Jonathan tradurrà parzialmente questo incontro anche perché sarà l'incontro supportato da un testo in inglese e un testo tradotto dello stesso studio biblico, quindi avremo tutti gli strumenti e magari anche come dire, uno spunto in più per fare per impegnarci ad apprendere la lingua inglese, per chi ancora non dovesse avercela. Ecco, questo quindi è, diciamo un po' il dietro le quinte di questo evento, che quindi in questa domenica del 24 di marzo, Domenica delle Palme, rimando in onda e ringrazio il Signore perché comunque questo evento è anche a valle di una collaborazione, di un'amicizia col fratello Jonathan, che ringrazio, ma anche altri e altre che si sono comunque resi disponibili a rendere possibile questo evento. Quindi un buono studio biblico e niente, a più tardi.
Vorrei presentare chi è la nostra relatrice questa sera, che è la professoressa Kathy Ehrensperger. Allora, la professoressa attualmente ricopre il ruolo di Research Fellow all'Università di Basilea, nella facoltà di teologia. È una città cara a noi riformati, visto che è la città di Karl Barth, tanto per dire un nome, però è anche una delle migliori facoltà di teologia al mondo. Per quanto accademico della professoressa è un curriculum estremamente ricco, però vorrei anche far notare una cosa, che in questo curriculum lei è anche una donna di chiesa, ne parlavamo prima, che anche attualmente predica nelle chiese riformate svizzere, e quindi anche il taglio, l'impostazione che dà, oltre ad avere un altissimo profilo accademico, è anche comunque un servizio rivolto alla Chiesa. Tra le tante pubblicazioni in questa sua carriera internazionale, che ha travalicato i confini dell'Europa, quindi è veramente in tutto il mondo, nel testo che avremo a disposizione questa sera abbiamo diverse pubblicazioni per una casa editrice molto prestigiosa che è TNT Clark, Io vi invito molto semplicemente ad andare a leggere il suo curriculum e anche la lista di pubblicazioni su accademia.edu, che è in libero accesso, per rendervi conto dell'ampiezza degli interessi e della profondità della sua ricerca. Questo per dire che questa sera veramente siamo onorati e gioiosi, e io in modo particolare, di avere un ospite così importante nell'ambito della ricerca paolina e del Nuovo Testamento a livello internazionale. E quindi credo che vogliate unirvi con me in un silenzioso applauso e caloroso benvenuto alla professoressa Kathy Ehrensperger. Grazie. So, Kathy, thank you so much. We are honored and thrilled to have you with us. And now I will share the screen with the translation, and then we can start your lecture. Thank you so much.
Great. No, a pleasure to be here. And I have to say, before I start, I'm really sorry I cannot address you in Italian. It's on my bucket list. I always wanted to learn Italian. So far, I didn't got that far. So you have to put up with me presenting you my thoughts in English. Jonathan has translated my paper in record time. So thank you very much for your work, Jonathan. And I really am very happy to be with you. This is a great opportunity for me. And I hope we have time after I have finished with what I prepared. If you have questions, I'm very happy to answer them. And of course, Jonathan will translate, or we put them in the chat and can take it from there. Okay, so I may tell you shortly, before I really start, of my journey with Paul the Apostle. I must admit he was not my first love. I could not understand him, despite 6 years of theological studies at the University of Basel. I had problems with Paul, problems with supersessionism, with what he wrote about women, and a number of other aspects. So I worked as a pastor, as Jonathan mentioned, full-time in the Swiss Reformed Church here nearby, the city of Basel. I loved my work in church. I must really emphasize that, particularly working with young people. That's not in your script, but it's just, the young people I really was involved with. But I also was involved during my time as a pastor in Jewish Christian relation groups, nationally and internationally. So this is how I learned of research in the English-speaking world about Paul, and I learned of Ed Parish Sanders' approach to first-century Jewish traditions, and of course on the so-called new perspective on Paul and so on. And then, so the journey continues. I will spare you with all the details, but just to let you know, I had my struggles with our dear apostle. So eventually I had the opportunity to do a PhD part-time at the University of Wales, and the result of this was my first monograph that we may be mutually encouraged, Feminism and New Perspectives on Paul. That's 20 years ago now. I can't believe myself. I had then the privilege to lecture at this university and deepen my research over the years for the last 6 years at the Abraham Geiger College at the University of Potsdam in Germany. Now, over all these years, of course, significant research has been done in gender studies. When I started, it was called feminist studies. Now it's called gender studies. But also in Pauline studies, a lot has happened over the last 20 years. When I started, or my first publication 20 years ago, focused on themes like identity, diversity, relationality. And of course, these are still topics and themes that are very much in discussion. So I think this book still can contribute to the discussion. But the whole discourse, the academic discourse, has moved on. In terms of gender studies, the field has actually exploded. And not only is the question which was debated at the time, to find ways to express women's identity in their own right, okay, that was at the time what we debated, what is women's identity in their own right and not really as the other of men. But now the debate has moved on, and what is questioned today is there such a dichotomy of male and female at all? You know this debate, it's going sometimes a bit wild in the public. I cannot enter into details of this debate at the level of theory. I just want to mention that this impacted also on Pauline studies. I will come back later to that today. Now, research, so there's one aspect which I'm particularly concerned in this gender study thing, which was not on the horizon 20 years ago. Research which highlights the relevance of the body, corporeality, the fact that we all are embodied beings living not only in particular times, but also in particular spaces, as individuals, on the personal level, but also as group. This was an aspect that was not yet on the horizon 20 years ago. And I think it is a very important dimension. We will come back to that as well in a moment. In Pauline studies, the field has also exploded in terms of publications and approaches. The new perspective is not so new anymore. There are further perspectives and they are labeled in different ways. I mean, there is the so-called radical new perspective, or there are movements beyond the new perspective, and there is coming back to the new perspective. I won't bother you with this. I'm just telling you, there's a lot of movement in Pauline studies, and sometimes it's difficult to keep up with it, not just for you, but for me as well. So much is published. So what is also different from 20 years ago is that today most Pauline scholars in one way or another approve that Paul was a first century Jew. I think that is a very crucial aspect. Many scholars, of course, would then qualify what kind of Jew was Paul then actually. Was he an anomalous Jew or a marginal Jew or an apostate who had left sort of Judaism but still Jewish? Now, I myself, I am convinced that Paul was a first century Jew, full stop. And so is his message. It's a Jewish message with implications for non-Jews. And this is what Paul is writing about. So the hermeneutical presupposition of what I'm going to talk about in more detail is precisely that. That Paul is a Jew, Paul's Judaism is not a question. I take it as the given. It is this context which is decisive for his reasoning and acting, also in relation to the question of gender. I will take up this topic, and it's still similar to what I've done 20 years ago, but I have learned in the meantime a few things. So I will deal with the topic in 3 steps. First is the question of gender in context, and I mean in the context of cultures of antiquity. Then women and Paul, and then Paul and the question of masculinity. So let's start with 1, the question of gender in context. This question and Paul's Judaism, they need to be considered in light of the time and space in which Paul operated. Now, of course, the time is antiquity, more specifically of the 1st century, and the space is the Eastern Mediterranean under the rule of the Roman Empire. This is the particularity of his and of his addressee's life. Thus, neither Jewish tradition nor the perception of gender should be considered without taking this context really into consideration. I jokingly sometimes say Paul was not a feminist. He was patriarchal, as were all in the societies and culture of that particular time and space. To state this is merely to state the obvious. I think we need to look deeper, not ignoring this patriarchal context, but trying to differentiate what we see. I do not consider it all that exciting to unveil patriarchal patterns in Paul's thought, because what else would we expect to find? What else should he have expressed? So I think there are more important questions than just that. So Paul, and most likely most of his addressees, were not part of the elite society of the elite of Greek and Roman societies. Since Paul seems to have had a good, maybe a very good Jewish education, he would have been seen as possibly some kind of a member of a Jewish elite as far as education is concerned. We don't know much more about his life circumstances. He says of himself, as you know, I'm a Hebrew of Hebrews, a Pharisee, educated to the extent that he was well informed in scriptural interpretation. He was so educated that he was able to dictate quite sophisticated letters, although not as fluent and elegant in Greek style as Philo, for instance. So his perception of gender is patriarchal, or as sometimes is said, androcentric, as any Jewish, Greek, Roman, and most likely Galatian, Egyptian, and Syrian perception would have been at the time. No surprise. However, gender in Greek and Roman cultures of the time was not a concept merely tied to what biologically might be considered male or female bodies. In Roman eyes, the only option, and I mean in the eyes of Rome of the time, I'm a bit embarrassed saying Roman and then sort of generalizing from that. Okay, in Roman eyes of the time, the only option to be a man, Latin a vir, was being born free into an elite family. This gave a boy the opportunity to get a proper respective education, and through that education, to become a man vir. He would have to learn self-discipline, strength, the ability to exercise power over others. That is, he had to learn to practice virtues. This was done in constant competition with other boys and later with adult male elite people who tried to maintain or outpass each other in their status as men. This meant they constantly had to avoid being seen as effeminate. A person not born free into an elite family had no way of becoming a true man in that sense, irrespective of their biological sex. Slaves, freedmen, women, provincial populations could only aspire to come close to this ideal of masculinity, but they could never achieve it fully. This means that although a provincial like Paul, a member of the Jewish people, in that sense, could never reach the status of a true man. However, there were some elite women who could be seen as almost becoming male. Gender was a concept not tied to men and women, but it expressed the hierarchy in status and values, which considered male slaves, for instance, to be feminine, and could potentially see a freeborn woman as behaving in a virtuous, that is, almost male way. However,
me está podendo ver la traducción. Aspetta, aspetta.
is everything okay? Sorry.
No, the translation has finished.
Oh. What? Okay. Are we all okay?
Va bene.
Okay.
Sorry, Kathy, the translation was not moving and not following
Oh,
the
it was
flow.
Però nella
No.
mia
If
Yeah,
you put it
yeah,
in the chat,
sure.
and everybody can open it. All right.
Yeah.
Okay. I continue. Is that okay?
Yes.
In the context of this dominating perception and practice, it needs to be noted that although the Jewish traditions and ways of life are not exempt from being patriarchal, alternative perception as far as gender is concerned can be found here. So maybe some of you read or looked at that article, The Question of Gender. What I said in that article is that it is obvious that men, women, and children gathered in synagogue assemblies, learning together on every Shabbat. At least this is what both Philo and Josephus claim. Now it's stuck again, no? Yeah. Do it like that, maybe. I think you have to go. Yeah, now we're on the right page. We're on the right page. I can see it. Okay. So, okay, now they were learning together on Shabbat. Okay. And at least this is what both Philo and Josephus claim. Philo tells us that the Jewish people, because they were educated, were a people of philosophers. And this included men, women, and children. Philo may paint an idealized image, but we need not doubt that joint gatherings of men, women, and children were considered normal. This is a practice which would be hardly conceivable in Greek and Roman cultural settings. At least strict segregation would have been practiced. So now we come to the next page, Paul and women. Okay. This pattern of joint gatherings is also what we find in the practice of Christ-following groups. Paul nowhere argues for segregation. The only guidance he provides concern the orderly conduct of mixed gatherings. This orderly conduct is actually the theme of most of chapters 11 to 14 of 1 Corinthians. The topics touching on gender are only one of the topics that Paul deals with there. The gender-related guidance in these chapters is part of the guidance concerning orderly conduct when one comes together, assembles. Thus, rather than merely reflecting a patriarchal gender hierarchy, for instance, 1 Corinthians 11, 2-16, is evidence of the active participation of women in gatherings of Christ groups. This is also the case when we look at 1 Corinthians 14, 33-35. It is presupposed that women are present. They should listen in silence, meaning they should not chat in the background when some teaching is presented by a man qualified to do so. Yes, only men are qualified to teach, but the women are present and learn. It is evident, according to biblical texts, and you find a few here on the screen, as well as other Second Temple literature in Philo and Josephus, that women were, without any question, part of the synagogue assemblies on a Shabbat, and they were active participants through singing and praying as did men. So Paul was guiding the assemblies in the proper conduct at communal gatherings, but he oriented himself in this guidance on Jewish practice. It is a Jewish way of doing things. Paul's guidance in this respect is Jewish guidance for former pagans, that is, for men and women who had been socialized differently in their life before they joined Christ. Moreover, it can also be shown that Paul's inclusive practice of table fellowship is rooted in Pharisaic inclusive table fellowship traditions, and the same is the case of Paul's acceptance of women in leadership roles. Thus, despite the hierarchical relation between men and women, which Paul sees as a given in the created order, and then immediately relativizes in this famous chapter 11 of 1 Corinthians, he apparently respects and supports women in leadership roles. The most striking example of this is the list of people to whom the addressees of Romans should pass on greetings. If you have a Bible with you, you might just briefly look into this list. In Romans 16, you can count the women mentioned. And you believe it or not, there are 12 women in leadership roles mentioned at the end of Romans 6, at the end of Romans in chapter 16. And let us just for a moment briefly check how they are characterized. What does Paul say of these women? There is a benefactor, that was Phoebe. They risk their neck, that would be Prisca. They were hardworking. They were imprisoned. They had been in Christ before Paul. They were apostles, prominent among the apostles. They were workers. There was a mother figure. This is remarkable. And it does not indicate any contempt or minor roles assigned to these women. They work alongside or with men or on their own. And there is no indication that they were only working with women. So no gender division in the work for the Lord can be discerned here. Phoebe is singled out, and Paul pleads especially for support for her, possibly because she is the one who transmitted the letter to Rome. If she was, she also was the one who would have performed it. She would have read it and explained it to the addressees. The letter carrier in antiquity most likely was the one who knew the content of the letter. Imagine, you could not read in antiquity if you did not know what you were reading. The writing was without space, stop, and comma, so you needed to know what was there. When you read the whole letter aloud to others who were present. Possibly she also had a role in the preparation of the letter and of Paul's outreach to Spain. If this is so, Paul entrusts a woman with the most significant task in relation to the letter to the Romans. This does not really cohere with expectations one would find in the majority culture concerning true manliness and leadership. As we have noted, gender, the attributes of male and female, manliness and femininity, were neither considered merely biological nor static, but were attributed according to status and performance in Greek and Roman societies. Paul, in his significant cooperation with women, does not seem to be cohering with such perceptions of masculinity. The leadership roles attributed to women was not inferior to that of men. They would have been manly women in the concept of Greek and Roman ethos. In Jewish tradition at the same time, the gender categorization was more dualistic. There was no fluency in Jewish perceptions of gender. Roles were gendered, but they were maybe slightly flatter in terms of hierarchy. I say that with a bit of caution, because as mentioned, everything has to be looked at under the condition of patriarchal androcentric perceptions. So much for that on Paul and women, and I know there would be much more to say, but I would like to turn for the remainder of the time to Paul himself, and not the female aspect, but Paul and the question of masculinity. When we consider I have to see, I have all my pages here. Oh, sorry, next page. When we consider the trajectories of Paul's self-portrait that shimmers through his letters in the context of the prescriptive Greek and gender discourse of the first century, clearly, Paul's manly credentials do not seem to take him all that far. First and foremost, he is not born into Greek and Roman nobility. He is a provincial, a member of a subordinate people under Roman rule, as I mentioned before. He was thus not a member of the Populus Romanus, but he was one of the subjugated gentes listed in Augustus' Res Gestae and visualized, for instance, in the Sebasteion of Aphrodisias. As a provincial, Paul did not have the prerequisites of becoming a vir in the dominant Roman ideology of the time. Nevertheless, he claims power and authority in relation to the addressees of his letters. This is clearly a manly claim according to the cultural codes of the time, also within Jewish tradition. He insists that he is called to be an apostle, to bring about, in Greek, the hypakoen pisteos and pasintos ethnesin, the obedience of faith among all those from the nations. He claims that he has the right to admonish, to teach the Christ-following group he has established, and he even refers to himself occasionally as their father. Besides these bold claims, he refers to numerous experiences which seem to undermine directly precisely these claims. So, he mentions that he had been mistreated in Philippi, and he worked hard day and night. He is afflicted when writing to the Corinthians. He tells them that he was utterly unbearably crushed. He refers directly to aspects which in the eyes of others qualify him as feminine and thus disqualify him from a leadership role. In the controversies prevalent in 2 Corinthians, he is charged with weak performance in person, and the inconsistency this indicates compared with his bold letters. He is charged to be an unskilled rhetorician. This is clearly an emasculating attack. He is working with his own hands to earn a living. He admits he is not able to lord over the Corinthians like a master over slaves, or benefiting from them, and in that sense, he is weak. Whether all of the hardship catalogue in 2 Corinthians 11, 23 to 28 refer to actual real-life experiences of Paul need not deter us here. What is remarkable is that Paul lists such a number of emasculating mishaps in his attempt to establish his mainly leadership credentials. Probably the worst of all these is his reference to the marks of physical abuse and humiliation on his body. And this is where the theme, the relevance of body in current research comes in. Paul carries the scars of beatings on his back. This marks him as an enslaved, violated male who is not able to preserve his bodily integrity. This, in Roman perception, meant that he was at the lowest end of the gender scale. A true man, vir, would maintain his physical integrity at all costs, as this is clear evidence that he is in charge of his own life and able to maintain power not over himself, but over others. These scars locate Paul on the feminized side of the dominant perception. A provincial, he was part of a subjugated, hence feminized people who, in Cicero's words, were born to be slaves. It has to be noted that this does not attribute to Jews a slavish nature, but it means that in Roman perception, people who were conquered, subdued by Rome, were destined by the gods to be enslaved, inasmuch as the populus Romanus was destined by the gods to rule. As Cicero states concerning the Jewish people, and I quote him, "But now even more so, when that people by its armed resistance has shown what it thinks of our own rule, how dear it was to the immortal gods is shown by the fate that it has been conquered, led out for taxes, made a slave." Now I have a bit on Philippians. Jonathan, I don't know whether we want to go into this, so we can show all this on how Paul actually fleshes out his leadership role. I look a bit to the watch. If you're still with me, we can do it. Shall we do it?
Yeah,
okay.
Please.
Okay,
Yeah,
the Philippians, okay, we look to Philippi now. The Philippians, like all other groups to whom Paul writes, I have to say in brackets, that's not on your translation. The Philippians had obviously entered a relationship with Paul upon their first encounter. And thus they considered him trustworthy as a leader at that point. As provincials, they share the status as members of the Gentes, ethne in Greek, that is, subjugated peoples. The addressees may have had links or occasional contacts with Jewish groups of some kind before meeting Paul. Hence, there might have been a level of prior trust in a member of this people among those who felt called by the message of Christ. But it appears that subsequent events had cast some doubts about his credentials. In analogy to the dominating elite ideal, where the credentials of a vir were not a given, but had to be established and re-established in continuing competition with others, Paul's authority and leadership role does not seem to have been considered a given once it had been initially established. So there is an analogy for addressees who lived in a Roman colony and hence were exposed on a daily basis to the claims of dominating Roman claims, even if they were not Roman themselves. In Philippi, most likely they were Greeks and Thracians, not members of the Roman ruling group. Someone who wished to maintain authority and exercise powers would be under continued scrutiny and had to prove again and again that he actually was at the top of the leadership game. In relation to Philippi, it has been noted that the tone of the letter is mostly positive, indicating a sustained level of trust between Paul and the Christ-following group there. However, the fact that Paul feels the need to emphasize his manly credentials in chapter 3 at the beginning there, especially in verses 4 to 6, in my view indicates that even here, Paul's authority is not quite on firm ground, at least not as firm ground as has been assumed. At least Paul seems to consider it necessary to affirm these credentials. Given the context from which he writes, and it is thought he is in a Roman prison, this should not come as much as a surprise. Moreover, he refers already in the opening of the letter to his struggles, his sufferings, and his hardships. Part of the disturbing list of seemingly delegitimizing credentials in the Corinthian correspondence may well have been known by the Philippians. Paul has been beaten, he says. He has been shamed like a slave, as I mentioned. Right at the beginning of his activities in Philippi, he had encountered problems, as he mentions in the letter to the Thessalonians. And now he is obviously, again, not in charge of himself as a prisoner. You cannot go where you want. You're not in charge. He clearly does not have the credentials of a man, of a leader, when considered from what makes a man. Now, this all leads us to the question, what is Paul trying to achieve by accentuating all of these unmanly credentials? Why does he emphasize so much that all these really hard things that had happened to him? It has been argued that he inverts the prevalent value system by this and presents a countercultural stance orienting all and everything on Christ. Now that Paul draws some analogy to Christ can obviously not be doubted. But whether this is a mere countercultural argumentation, and this countercultural argumentation would have supported him in maintaining his authority, is questionable in my view. How could that have happened? Paul, in my view, was involved in a process of intercultural communication. Now, in order for communication to be successful, there have to be links and analogies between source and target context. I mean, in as much as this is necessary in linguistic translation processes, there has to be something that links that can be at least resonates with in both languages. I will not go any further into this. Umberto Eco has written about this in a great way. Even the Christ narrative, an entirely Jewish narrative of the Second Temple period, would have been meaningless if there had been no analogies, narratives, and cultural codes in the addressee's sociocultural context and symbolic universe that would have resonated with this Christ message. And the addressees, remember, they are former pagans. Paul's addressees are former pagans. It is difficult to change ingrained, embodied perceptions and practices. Pierre Bourdieu has called this the habitus, what we are socialized in. This molds not just our thinking, but is embodied deeply in subconscious dimensions, as is evident in difficulties of intercultural communication and encounters today. And it's often manifest in many small aspects of everyday life. To detach the addressees, whom Paul obviously wants to win entirely from their habitus, would have been almost impossible. The question of what Paul was trying to achieve by presenting himself as a beaten, imprisoned, suffering leader in support of his authority claims is thus puzzling, to say the least. It is evident he wants to claim power and authority, but he seems to pursue a particular strategy by taking up the challenges and accusations raised against him. In my view, he does not do this in a countercultural vein. He does not do this by denying merely these discrediting aspects, but by presenting them from a different perspective. He does not deny that he struggles, has been near death, imprisoned, scarred and scared and beaten. And he does not glorify all of this as something that it is not. There is no glorification of suffering here, but I think a reinterpretation of what in Roman perspective are emasculating experiences unworthy of a true man. This reinterpretation does not amount to declaring weakness to be power, as in many traditional interpretations. Rather, it taps into another aspect of the Roman masculinity discourse and tries to switch the perspective on these experiences. Paul presents them not as those of a feminized, enslaved, disempowered, subjugated provincial, but as those of a courageous, manly fighter and athlete. Thus, apart from the fact that he makes these claims as a provincial, a member of the conquered people, who is not part of the dominant nor local elite, the masculinity Paul claims can hardly be described as countercultural. In order to be a trustworthy leader who exercises power in an empowering way, he has to relate, as I mentioned already, to a discourse the addressees can understand from within their own Greek, Roman, or whatever cultural context. It must make sense to them that Paul is a trustworthy representative of the message, despite significant indications to the contrary. I think Paul is juggling a difficult balance of cultural translation here. The message he transmits to those Christ followers from the nations is rooted and embedded in Jewish tradition. That is a tradition not necessarily in opposition to, but different from that of the addressees. This tradition had developed an inherently critical stance over against any absolutist power claims by rulers of this earth, under which Jews through various periods in history had lived. Although this did not necessarily lead to attempts at overthrowing rulers of this earth, it enabled Jews to develop strategies for cultural and religious self-definition and group preservations under the conditions of foreign rule. In Jewish tradition and life, there was an element of subverting hegemonic values and being critical of dominating institutions through their own traditions. They had developed a way of accommodating to changing rulers and at the same time of maintaining some kind of independence and compensatory self-esteem. The messianic message of Christ Paul transmits and embodies is entirely rooted in this tradition. The challenge he faces is to translate this message into the cultural world of his non-Jewish addressees. The cultural codes and encyclopedias may have been expressed in the same language, Greek, but this does not render them identical. A Jewish scholar, Tessa Rajak, has drawn attention to the difficulties that may have been involved for outsiders, non-Jews, hearing this language. She notes, and I quote her, "Since any one text, Jewish texts, can only completely be understood in terms of multiple allusions and resonances, the full sense of the words could not be conveyed by readers not nurtured in the language and the biblical precedents." That doesn't mean Greek, but the way the language is used, what resonates with the language. Just one example in brackets, the word for spirit in Hebrew, ruach, and in Greek, pneuma, resonates differently when heard from a Jewish perspective than when heard, for instance, from a Platonic perspective. That's just one example we can talk about. So, Paul's addressees were only just beginning to learn what it means to be a Gentile in Christ, in the context of precisely this tradition. A cultural translation process was on the way, with all the complexity this involves, including the non-translatability of certain aspects, understanding, transformation, and loss in translation. In order for this translation process to have any chance of being successful, there had to be some relation in the language, codes, and encyclopedias transmitted that were either shared or understandable to some extent by all those involved in this process. Paul's addressees had entered the process voluntarily. There is no coercive power that is involved. The relationship may be deemed to have been based on trust, a willingness to listen and respond, which is a necessary presupposition for such a translation process even to begin. To be heard, so as the addressees would respond, Paul had to be a trustworthy messenger. A trustworthy messenger had to be seen to be trustworthy according to the message he conveyed. He had to embody that message. Now, there seems to be a tension. The message Paul conveyed did not cohere with the dominating values the addressees had been exposed to, even though they most likely were not part of the elite. As to the challenges to which Paul seems to reply, these were related to the Roman perception of a true man who displayed the characteristics and credentials of a trustworthy leader with legitimate power and authority claims. What is considered emasculating and disqualifying with regard to leadership credential is, in Paul's view, what actually precisely does qualify him as a leader who fully embodies the message he proclaims. He sees the marks on his bodies and the hardship he endures in analogy to Christ's suffering. His imprisonment is for the sake of Christ and for the benefit of the brothers. And his weakness renders it clear that whatever is achieved is due to God's power and not his own. That does not mean that weakness is identified with power. Weakness is not power, but through and despite human weakness, God's power manifests itself. Inasmuch as this self-presentation is in tune with the sufferings of Christ, it is also rooted in Jewish tradition, not in glorifying suffering and weakness, but in acknowledging the limits of human power and ability, even when exercised in the service of the one God. In that sense, the leadership credentials Paul advocates are different from the leadership and masculinity ideals of the dominating imperial ideology. Scriptural leadership notions paint images of kings and prophets precisely in this vein, with even Moses, although the greatest of all prophets, being depicted as sometimes doubting, losing heart, and being weak. Paul presents himself as a man in a similar vein. But how could a cultural translation process in the context and under the conditions of imperial rule for people socialized so differently work? Whatever Paul really thought, and I do not claim to know that exactly, whatever Paul really thought, although he seems to only reluctantly and in an inverted way to participate in this dominating manly discourse, he nevertheless does actually interpret his embodiment of the message if in terms of certain aspects of the dominating masculinity discourse. His interpretation of how he embodies the values of the movement is not countercultural, and it doesn't undermine masculinity perceptions as such. We may be disappointed, but I think this is the way it is. What he challenges is the perception of others in the movement who are questioning Paul's role as a leader because of his scars and shortcomings. Paul maintains that these are not signs that he has been deprived of being in charge of himself, but rather that these are the battle signs of a brave, manly, virile soldier who is fighting for the message and for the groups that came to exist through his activities. He presents himself as a good soldier who is able to endure hardship, is able to fight, is courageous, facing up to dangers, even risking death for the sake of those he is entrusted to lead. He uses military language when taking up the challenge of so-called super apostle and claims, "We do not wage war according to human standards, for the weapons of our warfare are not merely human, but they have divine power to destroy strongholds." We may struggle with words like this, but in addition to such fighting metaphors, he also evokes the image of the athlete who does not give up, but keeps running until he arrives at the goal. These are images, codes, and encyclopedias of masculinity, which are very much in tune with certain notions of the dominant image of a true man in the culture of the addressees. So Paul does not deny or refute the points of reference raised in the accusations against him, but he takes them up and turns them round, claiming that his credentials, although different from those of others, render him precisely the credible, manly, virile, and virtuous leader they had trusted when they first met him. Far from idealizing weakness, he maintains, I quote, "I'm strong in everything through the one who empowers me." He, through the power of God, remains in charge of his destiny, remains in power of himself, and thus refutes the feminizing, emasculating charges raised against him. He presents himself as embodying truly virile virtues, as a credible agent of the alternative message he conveys. But it is an image of manliness which is nurtured, I mentioned it before, and I want to hammer this in. It is an image of manliness which is nurtured in Jewish traditions. And I would like to remind you again of heroes of the Bible. There is no hero in the Bible that is without weakness. They are scarred, troubled, they fail. They don't give up in their walking in the ways of the Lord, nevertheless. Remember David, Solomon, Elijah, Jeremiah, and Moses, and I could refer to numerous of these heroes in quotation marks of the Bible. This is the image transmitted: men with limitations, not with boundless strength, overcoming all and everything. So there is within the Jewish tradition an alternative image of man from which Paul draws in the presentation of his manliness. Now to conclude. I hope it has become evident that Paul, by taking up the challenges to his leadership claims, does not primarily subvert dominating Roman masculinity perceptions, but presents experiences and bodily features which are meant to emasculate and disqualify him as a manly man and leader in a different light. It is the perspective of other aspects of the dominating masculinity discourse through which he presents these very same experiences as those of a true manly man, a courageous fighter and athlete, as someone who is more than qualified to be recognized as a leader and apostle within the Christ movement. He does not argue in a countercultural vein to re-establish his leadership credentials, but engages with the prevalent discourse and presents himself in light of this. In order to gain recognition, there were hardly any other concepts available for Paul. We may regret that, but I try to envisage him in his context. Even though he felt commissioned to convey a message which inherently undermined the hegemonic claims of the imperial power, in order to be able and gain and regain respect and authority among his addressees, he had to some extent speak the embodied language of masculinity of the dominating sociocultural context of his time. Even if he exercised his leadership role in a way that differed from that of dominating power, as I have argued in another book, Paul and the Dynamics of Power, in order for him to be recognized as a leader, and in order to exercise power in an empowering way, which he did, in my view, he had to demonstrate his manliness somehow according to prevalent cultural notions, at least so they could understand and accept it. So in his perception and activities concerning gender, I think Paul is Jewish through and through. But as a mediator of a message from one cultural realm to another, he had to play and not play the game of accommodation. So we find trajectories of the masculinity discourse of the Roman world interwoven with the Jewish emphasis on the limitation of any human power. We find gender hierarchy interwoven with the Jewish notion of women participating in assemblies and leadership. And we have Paul's emphasis on particularity diversity and relationality as core to the life in Christ. Thank you very much for your attention and patience with me. Now we have this light, so.
Sorry. Thank you very much for your rich lecture, and it went so in depth, and we are really grateful because you gave us a lot of materials to chew on and to think through, and also to we have been stimulated to read afresh many famous passages we read through and through every Sunday. So thank you so much. And now I will give some references to your work more precisely. So I will turn for a while into Italian.
That's fine, absolutely fine.
Vorrei darvi alcuni riferimenti se volete poi approfondire le piste di ricerca della professoressa, e in particolare vorrei riferirmi a 4 pubblicazioni che poi potrò eventualmente ancora inviarvi insieme alla traduzione della conferenza e al testo originale. Allora, nel 2004, prima pubblicazione per TNT Clark, that we may be mutually encouraged, Feminism and the New Perspective on Paul. Poi abbiamo, che è stato citato durante la conferenza, un testo del 2007 che si intitola Paul and the Dynamics of Power, Communication and Interaction in the Early Christ Movement. Nel 2013 un altro testo dove si parla in maniera estesa di questo processo di traduzione culturale che Paolo opera, sempre per TNT Clark, Paul at the Crossroads of Cultures, Theologizing in the Space Between. E recentemente, 2019, una raccolta di saggi, uno più bello dell'altro, che vi raccomando insieme a tutti gli altri 3 libri, è Searching Paul, Conversations with the Jewish Apostle to the Nation, Collected Essays. Ok, allora, io ho visto che nella chat qualcuno ha già fatto una domanda. Io vi invito, se ve la sentite senza nessuna vergogna, di chi vuol fare una domanda alzi la mano, c'è la funzione virtuale, può farla anche direttamente in inglese se la sente, altrimenti la può fare in italiano, io cercherò di tradurla con i miei limiti di traduttore, quindi ci sarà qualche lost in translation anche forse da parte del sottoscritto. E quindi niente, io direi, intanto vedo una domanda di Iglia Coda Zabetta, è presente? Sì. Ok, posso tradurla io, la domanda in chat? Ok. Allora, intanto la leggo per tutti. If you deem appropriate, Kathy, I will translate the first question was written during the lecture in the chat. Allora, in italiano la domanda dice: come ha insegnato il rispetto fra uomo e donna, fra schiavo e padrone, giusto in rapporto con i tempi in cui viveva, forse ha testimoniato anche con il suo corpo e le sue debolezze il messaggio di Gesù? So, I will try the translation. Paul taught respect between men and women, and even in the relationship between Lord and slave. But the question is asking, maybe as he also taught with his own body, and incarnating with the weaknesses, with his weaknesses, also the message of Christ, as Paul incarnated the message of Christ through his weaknesses and through his body. That is the question Mrs. Zabetta asked.
Well, if I understand right, yes, he did certainly teach respect between men and women in the context of his time, and master and slave. You know, it's these things that we are a bit troubled with. He did not advocate the abolition of slavery. That was just not an issue. I mean, that's another big topic. But he did embody the message of Christ, as I tried to say, with his. Otherwise, he could not be a trustworthy leader. Now, I mean, one of the things is that is often asked. Well, I mean, he worked with women, he accepted women. There was mutual respect comes through despite the hierarchy. He lived not married. He did not live. He decided not to marry. And sometimes, if I understand the question right, and sometimes it is said, well, but is that not nevertheless a bit of pushing back on this respect I just advocated? Because the end, I think it is not, because in 1 Corinthians 7, and it would be so great if we were in one room and could look at the text. Okay, in 1 Corinthians 7. He actually first talks about marriage and how you should stay together, and if possible, if both agree, even if you're married to a non-believer. And then only he says, well, I would like you to be like I am, but if you can't, then no. So he takes a step back. He says what he thinks would maybe be best, but he does not promote that. Yeah, that would be best, maybe. But this is not a denigration of men and women being equal and living together and so on. I think this is sort of, he mentions it, yes, because everybody knows he is living celibate, but he does not make this the norm. He doesn't make this the norm. Does that answer the question a bit, or?
Jonathan, I translate, then I ask the person.
Okay.
Ok. Allora, sì, sicuramente ha insegnato rispetto fra uomo e donna, sintetizzo chiaramente, ha insegnato rispetto tra uomo e donna e fra schiavo e padrone, però non ha abolito la schiavitù, se questo era un sottointeso, nel senso che appunto non era un abolizionista, nel senso che ha conservato appunto la struttura dell'epoca. E la cosa interessante, diceva la professoressa, è che in qualche modo, leggendo prima Corinzi 7, se ci fosse stato tempo di approfondirlo avremmo potuto vedere nel dettaglio anche questo, è il fatto che lui parte con il matrimonio. Lui non era sposato, non ha mai pensato di sposarsi, però in prima Corinzi 7 risponde a questa domanda partendo dal matrimonio. E allo stesso tempo però dice quello che pensa, ma sembra che prenda le distanze, come se lui quasi non fosse capace o non volesse entrare in questo tipo di relazione. Questo non è un denigrare chiaramente il matrimonio, ma lascia un po' la porta aperta, cioè ci sono persone per cui è possibile e ci sono persone per cui non è possibile, e lui si tiene da parte. È un po' questa ha centrato un po' la sua domanda o voleva sapere qualcos'altro?
La risposta sì, ha centrato. Io infatti avevo messo, diciamo, il rispetto o quantomeno la protezione, la non prevaricazione totale, in rispetto anche ovviamente al tempo in cui c'era la schiavitù, c'era comunque un messaggio maschilista molto forte, cioè non è andato lì a gamba tesa a sovvertire l'universo mondo, però ha incominciato a scalfire un qualcosa che all'epoca era sicuramente molto, molto forte, ecco. Poi che dicesse anche chi può si astenga dal matrimonio, l'ha detto. Ma, sicuramente mi ha risposto, la ringrazio.
Mrs. Dabetta said that yes, the question was properly addressed, and she just pointed out that she sees Paul as a starter of a process. He was not an abolitionist, but in some way, even if he stays into the boundary of his society, of the contemporary society, he was able to start something new, which slowly changed from the inside the surrounding society.
I would agree with that. I would agree with that. Yeah, of course. Something did change, or he started the process of change. Yes.
Ci sono altre domande? Signor Jean-Luc, prego. Aperto l'audio, sì.
Oh, yes. Does it work? Could you listen
Yes.
to me? Yes. I understand that you analyze in a very thorough way the work of Paul as bridging the difference from his original environment that is radically Jew to the Gentile world of the Hellenistic world. Is that correct? And in doing that, of course, there is a problem of a culture where the concept of domination is absolutely central. What makes a man is domination. It is for that, for example, a man who's an homosexual, a passive homosexual, is not a man because it's supposed to be dominated by another man.
Yeah.
So the master, the man, is a dominating figure, is a hero, is a warrior.
Yeah.
And there are all this beautiful virtue of the Greek man, of the Roman man, that are certainly not despicable. But then the problem, to me, is perhaps also, is Paul really a bridge between something extremely more radical to Jewishness, Christianity? Because the problem is Jewishness, Christianity, and Jesus Christ doesn't in any way try to impersonate the vir. On the contrary, all the radical Christian virtue are antithetical to Roman word and Hellenistic word. So is Paul also a bridge between this more radically opposite character of Christianity and the Hellenistic world, or not? I have an example. One of my father cousin was actually a missionary to Japan. And you know that the story of Christianity in Japan is quite complicated because there was a time in the 17th century where a significant proportion of the Japanese converted to Christianity. And then they were persecuted and the Christianity almost disappeared in Japan. Well, the problem in Japan is that of a crucified God, it's inconceivable from a traditional Japanese cultural point of view. A God who dies and dies in that way is not a God. And I suppose that the same problem, perhaps in a lesser radical way, was a problem that Paul encountered in converting Gentiles. Don't you think so?
Jonathan, shall I reply directly? Or do you want to translate the question?
Yes, because it's really difficult to translate that because it was a long.
Okay, I tried. Okay,
maybe I don't know if you deem appropriate. I will sum up. Okay, do you deem appropriate that I just give a sum up of the question, or maybe you?
I can reply, and that may indicate what the question was. Huh, Jonathan? Shall we do it like that?
Okay, thank you. Okay.
I reply
yes,
maybe.
Yes,
and then
perfect. Thank you.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So my stance is, I think there's a number of things that would need to be said. Okay. The Jewish tradition of the time was very much Hellenized. So there is a sort of interaction between Greek culture and Jewish culture. That's why we have so much information and literature in Greek, in Jewish Greek literature, Philo, Josephus, and many more. So Paul is part of that. So in order to communicate this Jewish message of Christ crucified and resurrected, never forget resurrected, huh? Christ crucified and resurrected. We always read the Christ narrative from the perspective of resurrection. God vindicated the man who was crucified. So in order to transmit that message, there had to be certain bridges. Otherwise, this message would not have spread. I try to just think in cultural anthropological terms. If there are no bridges, it's inconceivable. Of course, there are also notions in Greek and Roman philosophy in particular, which resonated with certain aspects of this message. That's why I say it's not countercultural. It is an alternative. It is not buying into that, but it's trying to transmit it so it is understandable. So I did a lot of work on how Paul exercises power, you know, how he is a leader in that book, The Dynamics of Power. And there I try to show that Paul, if he is not a credible leader, he cannot empower people. I think this is what Christ's message is about, empowering people. It's God empowers people to be who they are meant to be through Christ. So, but in order to get the message across, you need a certain amount of power. So that's what I mean. If it's completely alien, if something I say is completely alien, then there can be no communication. And I think even the gospel could only be communicated if there were certain things that actually resonated. Not everybody found slavery okay in antiquity, you know, and things like that. Not everybody thought that women should be secluded in the backyard of a house or so. So there were critical discourses going on as well, and into this, I think, the Christ message. So, yeah.
Allora, sicuramente un primo punto di risposta è il fatto che sì, il messaggio della croce, però c'è anche il messaggio della risurrezione, cioè che è in qualche modo Dio che ribalta la prospettiva. E quindi appunto in qualche modo fa giustizia a suo figlio. Da un altro punto di vista c'è questo, io riassumo, chiaramente c'è quest'altra particolarità invece, che è quella del fatto che nel processo di comunicazione, diceva la professoressa, ci devono essere dei ponti, altrimenti non è possibile la comunicazione. E infatti qui c'è la differenza. Il messaggio di Paolo, come è stato detto anche durante la lezione, non è controculturale, ma è un'alternativa. Quindi come alternativa si innesta su quegli agganci che la cultura contemporanea a Paolo, offre. E quindi ci sono degli aspetti che risuonano del messaggio cristiano, del Vangelo, che risuonano anche all'interno del tessuto culturale in cui Paolo e i primi cristiani operavano, perché altrimenti, come è stato detto, se non ci sono questi ponti, non ci può essere la comunicazione, quindi non ci può essere la ricezione del messaggio. E Paolo è esemplificativo in questo, perché sostanzialmente anche nella sua leadership incarna un'alternativa, ma incarna un messaggio che viene compreso e capito dai suoi contemporanei, altrimenti non potrebbe essere nemmeno lui credibile come leader. E quindi il messaggio, appunto, è stato detto anche durante la lezione, non potrebbe risuonare nelle orecchie delle persone che lo stavano ascoltando. Ho riassunto chiaramente, spero bene. This is a sort of an example of the lost in translation.
That's it. Yes, I mean, it's, yeah,
Yes.
I understand, you know, yes, I regret.
Oh, sorry. You are muted. Okay.
Yes, I'm off. I'm now. Yeah. I mean, this is one of the, it would be great if I could communicate with you in Italian, if I had done my bucket list, and that would make.
But the reverse is also true. It would be good
well,
for all of us to communicate, maybe in English or in German.
Whatever. I mean, but you're doing well. I mean, it's just to say, it's a lot to take in. I know this was very packed. This was very packed stuff. So I hope you make the translation available so people can read it again. And if you want to publish it somewhere, I'm happy for that to happen. I mean, that's.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
So just a station could be a.
C'è qualche altra domanda? Non siate timidi e timide, approfittate dell'occasione, perché non è un'occasione che capita tutti i giorni. Maybe I have a question concerning chapter 14 of 1 Corinthians. That passage you mentioned in the lecture about women staying quiet when a qualified man is speaking. You consider that passage original from the dictation or the pen of Paul, or some scholars think maybe it is a later textual interpolation?
Yeah, I mean, okay. The easy way out would be it is an interpolation. Paul didn't write that. That's the easy way out. And I mean, there is a textual indication. It's in some manuscripts. It's at the end of the chapter. So, okay, that's why. Now I think it's too easy.
Yeah,
I think it's too easy. It's in all manuscripts, just not in the same place. So we don't have any manuscript which doesn't have it. So I take it, okay, let's think Paul did write it. What did he mean? And there it helped me to learn that in Philo, for instance, there are passages where he says, when the scriptures are read and taught, interpreted on Shabbat in the synagogue, everybody should be silent, listening in silence, while the qualified men who are educated, explain. So there is evidence from the time that to be silent at a certain moment in, we would say in church or whatever, is a pattern. So I then try to understand, if this is known from Philo, what does Paul say? Women do not talk in the background. It also says in this part, they should ask their husbands at home. So this indicates that women should not be actively asking questions in a context of teaching. It's specifically teaching. And this is the cultural pattern. Yes, women do not teach men. Women should not speak publicly in a rhetorical way, but they actively participate, as we know from chapter 11, in praying and prophesying. And Paul does not say this is without using their voice. You understand?
Yeah.
So my interpretation is, this is about teaching. So there women should keep the role that is assigned to them culturally. but they are not silent in church, as it's then often translated. They should, you know, when I became a pastor, that the argument was used, the woman cannot be a pastor because Paul says women should be silent in church. I mean, it's an argument that has been used for hundreds of years. Yeah. And I think the Jewish parallels tell me, oh, Paul did not mean that in that general sense, but in a particular sense. I would say, dear Paul, today, 2000 years later, of course, I also teach. You know, that's a different thing. But in the context there, I take it it's Pauline. He wanted to just say, conduct these assemblies in an orderly way as is appropriate for such getting together. That's all.
Okay. So is it a sort of confirmation that he is Jewish at the core? I mean, this parallel with Philo is a confirmation that he is behaving in the Christ movement as from his heritage as Jewish.
Yeah, exactly. He argues from his Jewish heritage, from what he knows, from what he is socialized in. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes.
Oh, now I can hear you.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I don't know.
We can talk about that.
Yeah.
Purity and meal, and it's a big issue, and yeah.
Yes, it's really interesting because there's a lot of preaching on that matter. With I think it completely misses the point.
Exactly.
So yeah, it will be useful also for local preachers and for students also.
Yeah. I think that, I mean, that topic is, yeah. But you think you talk to your people, all I want to say, and if you have some funding and it's not a big thing for you and your people and work doesn't look out, I take it, but surely with the commitment to continue. And if you have, the other thing I was thinking about translations, you know, nothing has been translated into Italian. And if you want to look into that, I always know one needs money.
Something went wrong?
Yeah, no, it's...
Sorry, yeah. I didn't get it because the...
Una fine col botto. In qualche modo le ultime parole di Jonathan sono andate, non dico perdute, ma insomma non le abbiamo potute ascoltare. Quello che diceva Jonathan era che in anticipazione avremo ancora un altro studio biblico di questo tipo, completamente in lingua italiana, col professor Nofke, professore di Nuovo Testamento presso la facoltà valdese di Teologia, e vi daremo per tempo poi ogni specifica. Volevo ringraziare però non soltanto Jonathan di questa collaborazione che si è resa possibile con l'ottavo circuito, ma anche Giusy Bagnato, perché la locandina che riprendo qui, la locandina che insomma adesso rimetterò in sovraimpressione, e ha questa bella immagine, insomma, ecco, con questi colori e questo cristallo di neve che sembra sciogliersi, forse è un cespuglio, chissà, ma l'ho trovato molto suggestivo, molto bello per raccontare le relazioni, in quel contrasto che c'è tra il freddo e il topore che arriva. E ringrazio quindi per questo bellissimo studio biblico, disponibili anche a far circolare le note che vedevate in sovraimpressione, che traducevano appunto il testo della professoressa Kathy, professoressa e sorella, perché come abbiamo sentito è anche pastora in quei della Svizzera. E niente, fatto, diciamo, ecco, questo adempimento, e avendo ringraziato chi dovevo, saluto, mandandoci un buon arrivederci, ancora un augurio di benedizione, di edificazione per questa Domenica delle Palme, perché il Signore Gesù viene presto. Una buona giornata. Ecco, chiedo scusa, ecco il il volantino che non voleva uscire fuori, poi a un certo punto ha deciso di uscire fuori, e va bene, noi lo accettiamo anche così. Ma adesso non mi resta altro che mandare la chiusura e poi chiudere la diretta. Una buona giornata, una buona domenica.